The first step in understanding Metroid, both its origins as a game series and how it came to be what it is today, is to forget everything you think you know about Nintendo. Whether or not you like Nintendo or its products, if you have more than a few years of experience playing video games, you probably have a fairly good idea of what a typical Nintendo game is like. The cartoonish but tasteful aesthetic, the generally child-friendly premise and mechanics, the fun first approach to gameplay. Basically, the formula that Shigeru Miyamoto and his contemporaries first hit on with Super Mario Bros. In 1985 and have been mining diligently ever since. That is what you have to forget. Because Metroid does not belong in that category, and you could make a decent case that someone who thought like Miyamoto would be incapable of developing anything like it. After 40 years of evolution, with the occasional mutation, Metroid has never come close to fitting the mold of classic Nintendo. And if the day ever comes that a Metroid game is just as uncontroversially appealing, just as digestible as a Mario game, that'll be the day when the series is truly dead, regardless of how many copies that game manages to sell. The simplest way of articulating the difference between Metroid and its more successful sister franchises is to say that Metroid was a product of R&D 1, the first research and development group created by Nintendo's management, before it even made video games, while the classic Nintendo style, and most of the successful games that used it, were created by the team at EAD, an outgrowth of the original R&D 4 division. EAD is Mario and Zelda, but it's also Star Fox, Animal Crossing, and Pikmin. It's Shigeru Miyamoto, Takashi Tezuka, Yoshiaki Koizumi, Eiji Aonuma, and Koji Kondo. Everything that is famous about Nintendo, everything that makes Boku bucks today, can be traced back to the work of designers at EAD. It's a whole galaxy of gaming in itself. But in a strange way, once upon a time, so was R&D 1. This group of game designers may have been obscure, but it was prolific too. Like the people that made Mario and Zelda, the creators of Metroid worked on several other projects at the same time, and branched out still further as the years went by. R&D 1 began making video games in the early 80s, and it would ultimately rack up its own impressive list of franchises. Donkey Kong, Kid Icarus, Super Mario Land, WarioWare, and Rhythm Heaven, as well as numerous one-off projects. Like EAD, R&D 1 has its own distinctive style, which you can recognize in practically all the games that its team members have worked on. Whereas EAD games consist of simple mechanics polished to the nth degree and clothed in broadly appealing family-friendly aesthetics, R&D 1 games are, more than anything else, quirky. They feature unusual, even confusing mechanics. Sometimes this confusion is actually part of the game's challenge. Their aesthetic is willfully inconsistent, with artists often putting their talents at the service of deliberately odd and grotesque imagery. Story, too, is treated with ambivalence. Many R&D 1 games don't really have a proper story, while others contain far more story than they would need to make sense. EAD was noteworthy for how economically it designed its games, with no superfluous features or unnecessary story elements. By contrast, R&D 1 was profligate with its design, lavishing attention on tiny details, even at the risk of leaving basic gameplay elements underdeveloped. EAD spent a whole lot of time refining each project into something that would provide a simple sense of fun. R&D 1 was more interested in making its games unique, not caring whether the result was something literally everyone could enjoy. If EAD just wanted to make you smile, R&D 1 usually had a more nuanced objective, like making you laugh. Which makes its most prominent series an oddity among oddities, because this is the one Nintendo franchise that's almost 100% serious and hardly ever funny. EAD's magnum opus, uniting all their ideas about instant fun and broad appeal in one package, is the Mario series, a property known around the world and indelibly associated with the name Nintendo. By the same token, R&D 1's masterwork is Metroid, not because it summarizes everything they've done, that wouldn't be possible, but because it's the most ambitious thing to emerge from a team defined by its extraordinary ambitions. It's not very funny, but it's definitely weird, and that's what it has in common with R&D 1's other games. The appeal of the original Metroid is more complicated than Mario's, but at a basic level you can boil it down to two essential features, one of which is shared by several other Nintendo games, and another which mostly isn't. The first is its sprawling world, which isn't split into linear levels, but instead functions like an enormous puzzle, with collectible upgrades gradually expanding the player's ability to explore, until, by the end, every room on the map is accessible. Nintendo had already made a game that worked like this before, of course. It was called The Legend of Zelda, and its nonlinearity was at least partially inspired by tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons, in which players can theoretically perform any action and go in any direction that would be possible in real life. Zelda was much more restricted than this, but it still offered an experience that would have been unfamiliar to players of arcade games. A classic arcade game like Pac-Man or Frogger didn't even feature progression across a stage. All the action took place on a single screen, and both gameplay and story were heavily restricted by this limitation. Nintendo wasn't the first company to put out a home video game console, but it was arguably the first to put out one technically advanced enough to offer a fundamentally different experience from arcade games. Not the original Famicom, whose games were still quite arcadey, but the add-on disc system and its international equivalent, the Nintendo Entertainment System. Super Mario Bros. Was a revelation for a lot of home console owners, but it still worked as an arcade game. The Versus cabinet version was a big hit, and Nintendo's most successful arcade game of 1986. But games as full of content as The Legend of Zelda and Metroid simply wouldn't have worked in an arcade environment. Both depended on trial and error problem solving and a certain amount of grinding for resources, which slowed down their pace enormously. A full playthrough of either game takes hours, while Super Mario Bros., itself on the long side for an arcade game, can easily be finished in around 40 minutes by an experienced player. With Zelda, Nintendo was staking a claim to new territory in the world of gaming. It was saying, this isn't an arcade game, it's better because there's more to it. This is classic EAD stuff. Do what nobody else has done before, do it with flair and meticulous attention to detail, and change the landscape of gaming as you do it. So, what was R&D 1 saying when it put out Metroid? Here's the same idea all over again, but in space? Not exactly. While its world design clearly owes something to Zelda, Metroid has you traverse the world in a totally different way, and I don't just mean the movement upgrades you get. The difference in movement between the two games is fundamental. Zelda's world is like a map unfolded in front of you, which Link travels across the surface of, with very little vertical movement. Metroid's is more like an ant farm, a series of vertical and horizontal tunnels, which tests the player's platforming ability more than anything else. In this sense, Metroid is a sort of hybrid of Mario and Zelda, featuring the same free-ranging exploration as Zelda, but filling each room with gameplay more akin to Mario's. Mechanically, it's easy to see what Metroid borrowed from earlier Nintendo games. Thematically and aesthetically, the game is much more unique, and this is the other component of the franchise's enduring appeal. The fact that it's Nintendo's only fleshed out and intricately detailed science fiction story. Yes, I know there's Star Fox and Pikmin, but both of these series have unusual premises which pull them away from what you might call classic sci-fi, and more in the direction of science fantasy. Star Fox has its animal people and a rather soap opera-ish backstory, while Pikmin lacks the element of space exploration entirely, and has a more relatable, Earth-inspired setting than most science fiction. More importantly, there just haven't been nearly as many Star Fox or Pikmin games as you see in Nintendo's major franchises. And on top of that, Pikmin games tend to have pretty simple plots, while Star Fox keeps reusing the same plot over and over again. These are series that have become mechanically refined to a certain extent, but neither one has developed a really compelling backlog of story content. But Metroid, in common with The Legend of Zelda, has managed to build a substantial universe for itself, and it's done so while mostly sticking to the classic sci-fi mold. Weird alien races, robots, space travel, and advanced technology are all core elements of the franchise, which it constantly resorts to in making new stories. In the same way that Halo was Microsoft's go-to science fiction series, Mass Effect was BioWare's, and Fallout was Bethesda's, Metroid was where Nintendo fans went to get their futuristic fix. And the complexity that makes Metroid interesting isn't necessarily a recent development either. Even in the very first game, you can see lots of narrative and setting ideas straining against the limitations of 8-bit hardware, in the same way as Zelda. When these series migrated to 16 bits, and later to full 3D, the level of detail never felt like it was being completely made up. Instead, it seemed that you were finally getting an uncompressed look at how the designers had always pictured their work to themselves. So when we talk about the legacies of these franchises, the gradual accumulation of essential elements which makes them unique, that's a very different thing from the legacy of the Mario series, which I discussed last year. Mario started out simple, and was built up over several console generations into an enormous pile of ideas, before being cut back down into something simple again. Metroid, on the other hand, was complicated to begin with, possibly the most elaborate and confusing game Nintendo had ever produced. And rather than introducing tons of totally new ideas, its sequels favored the elaboration and recombination of existing ideas into new arrangements. In this mini-series, I'll be exploring the history of Metroid's story and gameplay ideas as they've evolved over the past 40 years. This includes characters, setting details, enemies, Samus's power-ups, and general design concepts like speedrunning, or the series' bizarre definition of a bounty hunter. A surprising number of these ideas were already present in the original game, but at the same time, each major entry in the series added enough new ideas to be worth discussing separately. That being said, I'm only going to cover the games that were formative for the series as a whole, which means I'll have to mostly ignore remakes such as Zero Mission and Samus Returns, since the contribution of these games was largely aesthetic rather than conceptual. I also won't cover the Prime games in this series. It's true that they had lots of new ideas, revolutionary ones too, but these generally weren't incorporated back into the main series, which technically makes Prime and its sequels a dead end from a legacy perspective. A long and winding dead end, admittedly, but a dead end nonetheless. Oh, and I'm not including Other M either. I really struggle to identify new elements from Other M that made it to future games, unless you count Samus doing acrobatics while shooting stuff. Arguably, Samus Returns and Dread don't do that in quite the same way though, particularly since they're both 2D, while Other M was in 3D. So, excluding Metroid Dread as well, since it's the most recent entry, and we still don't know which of its innovations are going to appear in the future, that leaves us with only 5 data points to cover. 4 of these are video games: Metroid in 1986, Metroid 2 Return of Samus in 1991, Super Metroid in 1994, and Metroid Fusion in 2002. They're much more widely spaced out than Mario or Zelda sequels, and the more than 20 years since the last point is unfortunate, but talk to Nintendo about that, not me. It isn't my fault we still don't have a sequel to Dread, or that 2 of the last 4 mainline entries have been remakes, and one of them is a god-awful mess. Also, maybe you're intrigued about the one thing that isn't a video game. Well, you should be. It's actually a tie-in manga for Super Metroid written by Benimaru Ito, and featured in 5 issues of Nintendo Power from 1994. This is not only a great compliment to Super Metroid from a story perspective, but also a really gripping story in its own right that features elements which wouldn't appear in the series itself for many years to come, including the backstory of the Chozo on planet Zebes, and the existence of other bounty hunters who both help and hinder Samus in her work. If you've seen any of my Year of Mario videos, the way that legacy elements will be dealt with should be pretty familiar. I'll be dividing them into 3 broad categories: people and places, roughly corresponding to the story of these games; enemies and upgrades, which have more to do with the gameplay; and general design concepts, which affect both story and gameplay. Metroid is not a character-focused series, with even Samus herself rarely speaking over the course of a game. But if you're willing to define the term character somewhat broadly, then every Metroid game has had at least 2, and there have been attempts made to give some of them an arc over the course of multiple games. More relevant to Metroid's design are the places Samus visits, which are always important because of the constant emphasis on exploration. Journeys between the various regions of Zebes, and later other planets, mark the big swings in each game's difficulty curve, and add visual interest to the proceedings. By the time the Prime games came around, setting-related lore had become a distinctive aesthetic hook that set Metroid apart from Nintendo's other big franchises, and setting details were arguably more crucial to the series' identity than ever. Of course, we're not talking about Prime in this series, but it's just as well to bear that fact in mind when we consider the evolution of the main franchise alongside it. Upgrades are another important component of Metroid's continued success, and here again, we find a surprising number of them present from the very beginning, though each of the games we'll be discussing contributed at least one major new upgrade to the collection. In typical Metroidvania fashion, they're closely tied to each game's level structure, being encountered in far-flung corners of the game world, while also enabling further exploration. Enemies are less of a big deal, and because of the series' constantly shifting art style, they lack the instantly recognizable simplicity that makes Mario and Zelda enemies so iconic. Nevertheless, there's a fair handful of recurring enemies which play an important role in the gameplay of Metroid, so we'll be sure not to ignore this aspect of the series completely. And finally, we have general design, the vaguest category, but in a way the most critical in defining Metroid's unique style. The structural qualities which were practically exclusive to Metroid games, until Konami started using them for Castlevania in the late 1990s, are unsurprisingly also the qualities that once set the games in this series apart from all other action-adventure games, including those made by Nintendo and even R&D 1 itself. Because the storytelling in Metroid is subtle and understated most of the time, it's the way these games feel while you're playing that makes them stand out, and general design is what makes that magic happen. But, then again, one of the things that becomes clear when you start diving into the history of Metroid is that if all you've done is play the games themselves, you really don't know the half of this fictional universe. To get what its designers were going for, you have to read the manuals and even look into side content like Ito's manga. Which is a problem, because Metroid's slow rise to prominence means that many current fans of the franchise have played these games long after release, and without access to side content like a manual or game magazines. But then, another way of looking at that is, what else am I here for if not to bridge that gap? When I covered the Mario series, it was in a bit of a lull, despite having just reached a milestone anniversary. But Metroid is, if anything, in an even worse place right now, following the release of Metroid Prime 4, which isn't exactly the most hated game in the series, but I think it's fair to say it's one of the least loved. Mario can withstand a few lean years at this point, but I think Metroid could use a little TLC from its fans. So if you're a casual admirer of Metroid who'd like to learn a little bit more about a chronically underrated gaming franchise, stay tuned, and I hope I can throw some interesting facts your way. And if you're a total Metroid nerd who knows the franchise down to its mitochondria, think of this as a guided tour of the good old days, which you can nod your head to and think, yep, now that was a good idea. And if you don't like Metroid at all, what's wrong with you?